Hi everyone, welcome to my talk, VR is for Everyone, Designing Comfort in a Night in the Attic. My name's Tabby, and I'm the UX Director for Mighty Yell. We're an independent game studio in Toronto, Canada. I'm very pleased to be speaking at GAConf for my second time this year. My last talk here was about UX and accessibility for our previous game, The Big Con, and today I'd like to walk you through a brief accessibility postmortem for our VR title, A Night in the Attic. So let's talk a little bit about the process and thinking around making our studio's first VR game accessible. A Night in the Attic is a VR game made for the Meta Quest and Quest 2 and was released in April of 2023. You play as a child in your grandmother's attic, where you discover a magical tilting marble game based on Camelot of Arthurian legend. You play as a toy version of Guinevere in the game within a game in an adventure to save King Arthur. You solve environmental puzzles by tilting and rotating the board and using various tools found within each level to tinker with the world inside the board. As you'll see, A Night in the Attic was designed as a fully seated experience. So let's get into our problem space a little bit. Our first question, the big question is VR accessible? So VR is an inherently body-focused technology with emphasis on full body movement through space and full perception of alternate reality. In most cases, games and other experiences designed for VR must make assumptions about how a player's body takes up space, which can include their height above the ground, their physical size, the length of their limbs, and more. How they function, especially in terms of mobility, so not just for hands, but also potentially for outstretched arms, bending at the waist, their neck strength in the headset, etc. And how players will perceive the environment presented, including vision and hearing, as well as the connection between visuals and proprioception, which when disrupted causes simulation sickness. So as a technology so concerned with embodiment, VR games have the potential to be, and very often are, inaccessible in execution and full of barriers to play. So when we set out to make A Night in the Attic, we designed our game from an accessibility-first mindset, performing a full accessibility audit prior to finalizing our game mechanics. Our first step was to conduct a review of existing resources. VR accessibility is still an emerging field with several means of approach. Our main resources were the game accessibility guidelines. Our studio has used this list for several titles and they're pretty comprehensive, but they're not really targeted for VR, and simulation sickness especially needed to be addressed separately. We also used the meta guidelines for accessibility, which is a really good primer for some general VR considerations and best practices. And finally, we used a white paper titled Accessibility Guidelines for VR Games by Heilemann et al. That covered several sets of guidelines that were available in 2021. I found this source really invaluable for producing our final list of features. We also watched previous talks and reviewed general articles by disability advocates regarding VR. I've provided links to these resources included at the end of the presentation, as well as a link to a site where you can view the resources later, just in case we can't get those to you separately. The next step was to synthesize these guidelines into a set of recommendations. I made note of features that were already completed or built into our design plan. This process is very dependent on your game's plan mechanics. Next, we ran a cost-benefit analysis. As we're a pretty small team, we're fewer than 10 people. We prioritized accessibility features that we could most easily implement on a very tight budget and that could significantly reduce barriers to complete the game. I recommend running this activity with the team, or at least your design and tech leads, but preferably also art and audio, to determine the feasibility of each feature. You can categorize and rank potential features by development time or effort and an estimation of the benefit to the player base or reward. Of course, these priorities can change when you get to testing, but this activity will give you a really good starting point for your production plan. So during development, the next step is to test the features. You can start with internal play tests with team members or other easily gotten players for first impressions and any major barriers. We used a basic survey that all playtesters completed, which included both data for persona and marketing and questions designed to find pain points. We tested with a number of disabled players who gave more targeted accessibility feedback and observation in interview form, followed by the general exit survey. Our last step is to reprioritize incoming concerns from testers and adjust the design. You can and should do this several times during development, assuming you have time permitting. You'll see throughout the talk that we put really great importance on step 4 and 5. Though many of our features were built in based on the initial audit and design, many more were added or adjusted as a direct result of our playtests and interviews with players, especially with our disabled playtesters. So let's get into some examples. As we've seen, the relationship of a player's body to space is very intrinsic to the VR experience, so it feels appropriate to address accessibility using the same thoughtful processes used for designing physical environments and objects. I'd like to examine some of our accessible design choices through the lens of the 7 Principles of Inclusive Design, a framework developed by real-life architects and product engineers. For my own purposes, I've slightly renumbered the principles, putting equitable use at the end. But the principles are flexibility in use, simple and intuitive use, perceptible information, tolerance for error, low physical effort, size and space for approach, and equitable use. We'll walk through one challenge for each principle, covering a range of barriers in mobility, input, attention and cognition, visual, auditory, and comfort concerns for a night in the attic. The first principle is flexibility in use. It states that the design should accommodate a range of individual preferences and abilities. This could refer to how a player interacts in VR using different kinds of inputs, including gripping versus pointing, handedness, playing while sitting versus standing, etc. The idea is to provide as much inherent choice as possible. Our primary mechanic is about tilting. Players can tilt a game board in order to roll a marble character along platforms and small puzzles. And players in A Night in the Attic can tilt the board in 3 ways. So you can either use your left or right hand, and inputs are mirrored on both controllers, so it doesn't matter which they use. Two-handed by gripping either side of the board, kind of like a steering wheel, or with either analog stick, which actually mimics more traditional video game movement. Our initial design only worked with one-handed tilting, which was exceedingly difficult to control in early playtests. Using a marble board like the one in the game really requires 2 hands for stability. Players will constantly try to use both hands, confuse the system, and end up with a very buggy and frustrating experience. So we knew we could not avoid involving a second hand. A system was developed to calculate the position difference between both hands if both were gripping the board in order to find a tilt vector, and this proved to be extremely intuitive. We added the joystick controls originally for internal use, but it became really clear pretty immediately that this was just a preferred way to play for some of us, so we quickly made it an option for all players. But we kept that one-handed version in just in case players couldn't or didn't want to use both hands. To make sure players knew they had choices, we also visualized the tilt options in a prominent early tutorial, which encouraged players to try all the different kinds of methods available to find one they liked, instead of hiding it in an options menu. So, it's about outcomes. The game was tested successfully by a player who could only use one hand. They were able to play one-handed with their left hand with little difficulty and no need whatsoever to change their controls in the options. Gameplay came very naturally to them, and they liked that controls were smooth and easy to figure out, and said that they made sense to play and felt intuitive. A further measure of success is that player reviews frequently call out the different interactions, and different people prefer different methods of play. So someone said, controlling the character works great. At the beginning, it's fun and interesting to control the game board by tilting and holding it, but I quickly switched to using the joystick, which didn't detract from the fun. A second person said, the hand controls on the box feel amazing. It's like holding the real thing. And someone else said, the grab controls method is very original but difficult. It's based on the old labyrinths and ball game mechanics. The other method, I call it sticks controls method, is way better. So we felt successful in providing and communicating choice in this case. Our next steps would be to add control remapping or providing a mouse and keyboard layout so that more people could adapt the controls with alternative controllers or for their own comfort. This would already greatly benefit players using other headsets via Steam, as they can't currently remap controls inside the game. The second principle is simple and intuitive use. The design is easy to understand regardless of the user's experience, knowledge, language skills, or current concentration level. In VR, this could be providing multiple modalities for information, including text and visuals. Virtual reality can be overstimulating by nature, as it imposes an environment on the player's senses, everything from ambient lighting to organization of objects. Therefore, it's important to simplify aspects of that environment where possible. In early playtests, objects would float anywhere you left them. This would cause, like trying to place these floating objects on surfaces and organize them would cause players to be very forceful during playtesting, which would cause unexpected and pretty buggy collision problems. Players also didn't know where to put certain objects like Guinevere in between levels. So to fix that, we made all tools have outlined spots within reach so it's easy to find everything's place. We magnetized objects to their spot when they're moved close so players don't like force things into place. Objects teleport to their spot after a few seconds of disuse so players can't lose objects in the world. And this teleporting is displayed with a little particle trail so that players can clearly see the path that something took. So it's kind of like a toy box that cleans up after you. In addition, players have access to a hint notebook which displays drawings of how tools fit together. This preserves a sense of playfulness and ability to figure something out and doesn't rely on language. So some outcomes for this. Our playtesters stopped having trouble grabbing and putting away levels and scrolls and intuitively used the other tools like the bee jar to capture bees. The joy for players became in figuring out puzzle interactions like where to use the crank and not basic tasks. If we had more time and budget, the very last tool in the game is a large sword, and the only place we could think to put it was on the table itself, which was actually under the game board. It's pretty hard to see, and sometimes we do get like support requests about not being able to find it or to be able to play that part, so we would find a different place for it if we could. The third principle is perceptible information. The design communicates necessary information effectively to the user regardless of ambient conditions or the user's sensory abilities. User interfaces can be particularly challenging to implement in VR because they're often designed to be screen-bound. So common menu conventions assume the design will be overlaid over all visuals at a fixed distance from the camera. This doesn't really work in VR, which completely replaces a player's visual sensation of space. In physical space, if a player can't see something clearly, they can lean in or they can bring a screen closer, even if there are no in-game options such as font adjustment. But in VR, if you place something at a fixed distance from the player such that it moves back as they move forward, they'll actually be like helpless to change that distance. So if the information also requires a player to turn, they might miss it entirely if they're seated and immobile. So our solution is to allow players to lean in or be able to grab and pull almost anything in the game. It can be grasped, pulled closer, pushed further, so our players can adapt the world to their ability. So that includes dialogue, UI elements, and anything like text-based in the game world. This has a playful side effect that highlights the body-environment relationship well. You can throw things, you can place things in midair, peer at details in the environment up close, and even play with the dolls on the main menu, in addition to being able to grasp and hold the story elements. And as a fallback for harder to read text in the scrolls, you may have also seen here, we provided a grabbable dialog box that displays all the same text in a much simpler and higher contrast font. So one playtester especially liked to bring things close to see them clearly as they had poor vision. They really liked menu movability, saying this is hardly ever an option in VR and, quote, it sucks because it makes things hard to read, and they also liked font contrast. However, they struggled with being able to see Guinevere, the game character, when she moved behind level elements such as under bridges or tunnels. So because they played the board with the board like close to their face, they also missed out on tutorials which were placed above the center of the board and ended up above their field of vision. So if they played with the board like up here to be able to see things, then information that pops up above it was like impossible for them to see. So as a result, we ended up taking the feedback about Guinevere into consideration, and we implemented an X-ray shader to show where Guinevere is even when she moves behind objects. Tutorials were moved to the back of the board. So instead of being like above the center of it, they're moved back like away from the camera a little bit. So that, and they kind of stay at the back even when you rotate the board. So they're more likely to be seen no matter the board's distance from the player's face. You can still bring it closer to you, but it's going to be like fixed to the back instead of fixed to the center, basically. So this example highlights the extreme importance of testing with users with a range of abilities and perceptions in order to uncover these solvable problems, because both fixes were very straightforward. If we had the time and budget, we would have had an option to separate any interactable elements from the rest of the world, maybe with an outline shader. We had several playtesters who struggled with certain puzzles because they were pretty embedded in the environment. It was hard to tell what was interactable and what was not interactable. So being able to show where those interactions are possible could have solved that. The fourth principle is tolerance for error. The design should minimize hazards and the adverse consequences of accidental or unintended actions. In VR, this is most relevant to interpreting imprecise player movements through space and making design choices that anticipate those errors and actively try to mitigate them. So like it's pretty easy normally in a video game when you press a button, like it does the thing. In VR, you're often doing like small movements or things with your hands that are in space. So the game still has to be able to like interpret that as an action, right? And interpret it correctly. So we noticed two kinds of player errors, which are identified via our playtest questionnaire, our post-playtest questionnaire. We asked, was there anything about the world, characters, or mechanics that behaved unexpectedly? What was your expectation compared to what happened? And most causes of frustration were, one, players trying to manipulate one object would accidentally move something else. So for example, new tools are hidden in the levels. Trying to pick up a new tool off the board could pick up the entire level and force them to have to replay the level from the beginning. Obviously, that's not like super ideal. And secondly, the tilted marble mechanic is reliant on momentum, so it's very easy to lose control and fall off ledges or other danger zones and be teleported to the last checkpoint, which again is pretty frustrating. So in a pre-alpha playtest, one person wrote, I found it incredibly hard to move the character carefully and precisely. The overall feeling amounted to a lot of frustration. The puzzle seemed to demand very precise control out of the character very early on, and it felt like the rolling behavior didn't really afford me that much control. These mistakes didn't feel fair, fun, or joyful. So for these issues, I needed to work closely with the technical and level design team to come up with solutions that would improve the game feel. So firstly, we raise tools off the board when you first find them to physically separate the action from grabbing the board itself. So the tool like rises up into the air and then you can grab it from the air. We added gravity wells that you can store the character in while using tools to prevent her from rolling away unexpectedly. And finally, we added edge detection. So that helps prevent falls while preserving some illusion of challenge. Players can still fall off, but they need a certain threshold of momentum. We immediately stop momentum when the player stops holding the board or tilt control, so she doesn't like keep going. If you let go, she'll stop moving. And then finally in the options, as you can see here, we added a friction toggle to reduce the momentum to kind of slow the course of obstacles and make them easier to maneuver around. So there was some resistance to using options. That was the biggest takeaway that we had. Near the end of the playtest, one playtester was convinced to try lowering the character speed in the options, and they found they enjoyed the experience a lot more. But this took a lot of verbal encouragement by the interviewer. The tester wanted the option to be obfuscated as a difficulty choice or have the language around it changed. Their feeling was that using something called low character speed option felt like cheating. Despite these misgivings, they had an easier and more fun time playing with those options toggled. So we ended up renaming the options board friction and world speed just to mitigate some of that anxiety. Our level design changes went unremarked. Players didn't seem to notice our subtle means of preventing them from making errors, which is a really good outcome. So from a Steam review, rolling physics is very satisfying. It has nice inertia to it while being much more forgiving and responsive than IRL. If we had more time and budget, it's still really easy to accidentally grab the character off of the board because we can't really raise her up off the board. There are reasons that you might need to reset her progress, and so grabbing her is the way to do that. So that resets your progress to the last checkpoint, and if you do that accidentally, obviously you probably don't mean to go to the last checkpoint. So this is an intentional feature to prevent soft locks, but players often grab the character without understanding that it's going to reset their position. We could require and communicate further input intentionality, like an extra button press in addition to the grip to stop that from happening. That does introduce potentially some other accessibility concerns though around like doing two actions at once. Okay, the fifth principle is low physical effort. The design should be able to be used comfortably and efficiently with minimum fatigue. As VR designers, we have to be especially cognizant of how bodies differ in shape and ability. What is comfortable for one person might be painful for another due to an acute or chronic injury. So what one person can easily reach might be an impossible task for another. We can end up with objects that are inside the chests of larger bodied people or beneath the floor or desk of a seated person. One design problem that was identified pretty early on was that in order to examine puzzles from different angles and to easily control Guinevere's direction or use tools, players had to twist the game board or tools around, and playtesters were reporting that this was like awkward, uncomfortable, or painful. So one of the potential recommendations that we came up with during our cost-benefit analysis earlier in the project was that we should find a way to allow movement along compass points, to basically enable a person to easily choose a straight line path through a puzzle, since rolling with momentum is a pretty big dexterity challenge on its own. So what we ended up doing was implementing this board rotation on triggers at a fixed angle, so it's a 45-degree angle. You can still rotate the board manually if you want to, but combined with tilting, this enables players to move Guinevere in a much more controlled way by only using forward tilt and then using like basically the button to rotate the board when they need to change direction. This motion is much easier on wrist and elbow joints. So we couldn't totally fix the other problem, the tool use problem, and reviews do still mention that certain tools are awkward and clunky to use. It's most likely the crank that they're referring to, as it requires a sort of tight rotation motion, and that's something that we really did want to fix, and unfortunately we didn't have the time to. However, the easy board rotation seems to have made traversal pretty much a non-issue, as reviewers do enjoy the movement and the puzzle aspect and comment positively in most cases. So if we had time and budget, the other thing is we do still require the player to be able to stretch their arms out in order to grab tools off of their spots on the table. So we could add a feature to grasp a tool from a distance by pointing at it and having it teleport to you, and I think that would have been like preferred. But the challenge remains making sure that users don't accidentally grab tools when trying to perform other overlapping actions. The sixth principle is size and space for approach and use. Appropriate size and space should be provided for approach, reach, manipulation, and use regardless of the user's body size, posture, or mobility. So in VR, you're often required to sit or stand or move or reach in ways that traditional games don't require. When players need to reach items, does their own body, their assistive devices, or their furniture get in the way? And are they able to comfortably play sitting or even lying down? This design problem demands that we account for smaller or larger players, players seated at different heights, players having different reach distance, and having different tolerances for rotation and the bending of joints, as we've kind of seen in some of our other problems as well. So by far, this is the most challenging aspect of UX in VR. This brings together a lot of the issues that we already dealt with in our previous examples. In A Night in the Attic, the main considerations of physical space are the tilt board, the interactables, and the player's height compared to the table height where everything rests. The board itself needs to be out of the way of the tools, but not so far down that players would be stuck looking straight down and straining their necks from the weight of the head-mounted display. And this was complicated by the fact that the board actually, as you can see in this example, it changes size a little bit throughout the level so that players can see the entirety of a puzzle within the viewport when needed. So tools and the game board have to be visible and reachable all at the same time, without causing input errors or bumping into each other or being out of reach. In order to accommodate the board size changing, the cubbies that contain the other interactables had to be placed just far enough away to not clip the board without being totally out of reach. We considered making a tool rack for tools, but settled on putting them on their demarcated spots on top of the cubbies so that they would always be the same distance away as the cubbies themselves. And that was kind of the best that we could do for that situation. We did manage to fit everything in the space, and most people can reach all the items with a minimum of incorrect interactions. But disabled playtesters did still report some difficulty. So one person said, the problems I encountered were mostly outside of the world and were about the tools and other things on the table area. We haven't currently received bug reports or reviews that mention reachability, so hopefully we were able to address some of the problem with some success by just like adjusting how far away things were. But I mean, this is one issue that, like, if we had more time and budget, we would really have liked to have worked on this problem more. So we wanted to implement an option to choose your height in game and have the quest reset to that height if you required it, which probably would have helped a little bit with this. But that ended up being a pretty big technical hurdle for us, so we had to rely on the built-in hardware features. This is currently an issue for players using non-Quest headsets, unfortunately. Okay, so our final principle is equitable use. The design should be useful to people with diverse abilities. At this point, I've described examples of design solutions for a range of accessibility categories, including motor, visual, and cognitive. But one thing I haven't discussed so far is the impact of simulation sickness and other conditions, such as headaches or seizures, on one's ability to use a VR head-mounted display at all. Physical illness is a serious challenge and likely impacts more prospective players than any other barrier. It might be up to 80% of users. So that's like quite a bit, and it's probably the reason that it's not a super popular technology yet. So our decisions here were made via research rather than requiring playtesting and discovery. That's in part because I myself suffer from simulation sickness and migraines, and so I felt like it was better to test that on myself than have to subject anybody else to it. And because most of our playtesters are self-selected Quest owners, so they're a little less likely to be sensitive to it in the first place. Designing for comfort, which is the term used when you're discussing illness, often means making fundamental decisions about the scope of a game's design, like whether or not to include the ability to stand or move in the game world at all. These decisions must be made early on and will affect what further precautions you must consider later in development. A Night in the Attic was always planned to be fully seated, meaning that there are no gameplay elements that force movement or even rotation outside of a limited range. This design decision mitigates one of the largest factors of illness in video games, which is player movement through space. So levels are designed to be playable in less than 15-minute chunks so that players don't have to wear a headset for too long, as time spent in VR is one of the other factors for triggering illness. So a side benefit of this is that you can play in short enough bursts to help mitigate the neck strain issue as well. And finally, research suggests that objects moving toward your face quickly can have the same kind of effect on your vestibular system as you moving through space. So as you can see in this example here, the game board has large trees and tall objects that stick up pretty dramatically out of the board, and we anticipated that this might be an issue. So we created a transparency shader that could be applied to tall objects that basically fades them out when they get too close to the player camera. As some outcomes for this, as a result of these decisions, we routinely get reviews commenting that the game feels cozy, chill, relaxing, and comfortable, and there's not one mention of nausea in our reviews and playtests. If we had time and budget, we would add a more robust checkpoint saving system so that we could allow the player to start and stop anywhere and not just between levels, because that would enable them to, if they're having trouble with a level, to put it down and pick it back up again, and not have to like extend their playtime out a long time. So to quote disability advocate Christy Matheson, I think VR can be included in the future of accessible gaming with the right consultation and testing. It just needs to be more open-minded when it comes to what its ideal gamer looks like. I kind of take that to heart. And so with that in mind, here are some takeaways for making VR more accessible, comfortable, and open-minded. So 1, use existing guidelines from a range of sources to craft a reasonable set of accessibility features to work into your game. The earlier you anticipate a problem, the easier it will be to craft a solution that feels like part of the game. 2, get buy-in from your team by inviting them to help decide what the easy wins are so that you're all thinking about accessible design from the outset. I've demonstrated how multidisciplinary some of the solutions to these issues can be, pulling in expertise from not just UX and UI, but from your whole team. 3, assume a range of bodies, abilities, and spaces when crafting early designs, both for UI and overall game mechanics and level design. It will be much easier to validate a design that tries to account for differences at the outset than to realize that you overlooked something completely upon playtesting, especially if you only have the resources to playtest later in development. 4, when playtesting, include disabled players and disability consultants who will be the people best likely to assess your barriers to play. If your scope is narrow, it's okay to have just a few playtesters as long as they have a wide range of abilities. Be sure to listen very carefully to their feedback and watch how they play, as their issues will likely be ones that you haven't considered yet. 5, especially if you're working on a low-budget project, you will not have the scope to address every single barrier that your game presents. Choose features that you can reliably implement and that have the highest impact for your audience and your gameplay style, and have a plan for what you'll add first if you get additional post-launch budget. And 6, finally, be as flexible about how players can make progress as you can, with the attitude that being able to comfortably complete the experience is the most important factor, more important than fun, more than difficulty, and more than immersion. Everybody should be afforded the ability to finish the game that you work so hard on. So thank you very much for your time. You can find myself and Mighty Yell on Blue Sky for news on our upcoming games. And now following, here are the promised resources that we use to formulate some of our accessibility plan, as well as the link to where you can find those resources permanently. So thank you so much.